Shortest lived of any American fleet carrier in active duty. Her pilots managing to have the worst performance at Midway, getting sunk in her second proper action, while her surviving sister struggled on. Most famous for something done by pilots not her own, in planes she could never normally operate. All of those are certainly true about USS Hornet CV-8. All of them ignore the heroism of her crew in keeping her afloat as long as they did. They ignore how Hornets stubbornly refused to go down, keeping her crew alive long enough to evacuate, and even beyond. At Midway, for all the failure of some of her pilots and planes, her torpedo squadron still became a thing of legend for their dogged determination in the face of impossible odds. And if the Doolittle Raid didn't see Hornet do anything but ferry the planes to their target, she still did it, and it wouldn't have been possible without her. Hornet may be considered the unlucky sister of the Yorktown class. That doesn't mean she didn't give good, if short, service. That service almost didn't come into being in a lot of ways. After all, Hornet can be seen as a spare carrier. In the 1930s, the USN was quickly coming up upon tonnage limitations in how many carriers they could build. The big conversions, Lexington and Saratoga, had demonstrated that big carriers were far better. Ranger, conversely, had sharply shown the limitations of smaller carriers. So the Navy was, understandably, interested in a class of carriers somewhere between the two extremes. The bigger, the better. What the Navy would have really liked would have been a 27,000-ton carrier, though this proved impossible under treaty limits. The later Essex class would return to that stated tonnage when treaty limits were no longer a going concern. For the moment, however, the Navy had to go smaller. So the Navy would go for good enough. That would become the Yorktown class, a 20,000-ton carrier design. They still would have liked 3 ships of such a type, but even with converting USS Langley to a seaplane tender, that was impossible. Instead, you got USS Wasp, a scaled-down Yorktown. With that summarized history of the Yorktown class done, check out my Yorktown video for a more detailed look, we come to Hornet. With the general collapse of the treaty system in the late 1930s, and war clouds getting heavier and darker every day, the USN started to rapidly ramp up in size. The two-ocean Navy and all that. Now freed of treaty restrictions, the Navy wanted to start building up larger and more capable carriers. Those would become the aforementioned Essex class. However, designing a ship takes time, even if you take from older designs. As a stopgap to get another carrier into the water as fast as possible, you see a repeat Yorktown authorized, a good half-decade after the first two. That third Yorktown would be USS Hornet CV-8. Now, while Hornet had some improvements upon her older sisters, these weren't anything major. While it's only natural to see detail improvements after half a decade in design, the entire point of Hornet was to get her into the water as quickly as possible, so the improvements were limited mainly to detail work. Her superstructure was reworked a bit, which is an easy way to tell her apart from the older ships. Though it should be noted all 3 Yorktowns had different bridge structures from each other to some extent. Other improvements came to her fire control and sensor suites, as well as some minor adjustments to her propulsion plant. Otherwise, Hornet was a repeat of an old design, built out of a need for speed. Good thing for the Navy that the Yorktown design proved to be a very effective one in service. In any case, Hornet was laid down on September 25, 1939. Less than a month after the start of World War II in Europe, and again, a full 5 years after her sisters. Her construction time would set the standard for American shipbuilding during that war, though, as she was in the water only a little over a year later in December 1940. Her fitting out would take slightly less than a year following that, as Hornet commissioned in October 1941 with one Mark Mitcher in command. If you'll note the date, you'll see that Hornet entered service right before Pearl Harbor. She was, in fact, in the process of training up her crew when the Japanese hit the Pacific Fleet. While I'm sure the USN would have loved to immediately send her to the Pacific Fleet, Hornet had to finish her abbreviated sea trials and work up to make sure she wouldn't suffer an embarrassing failure in service. As such, she would remain in the Atlantic for some months to come. During that process, her plane guard destroyer, USS Noah, would drop depth charges on a suspected submarine, which would have been really embarrassing had a U-boat actually gone that close to Hornet on December 17, 1941. That would be about the most exciting thing to happen during her trials, though. other than joining up with the equally new Washington and North Carolina during the tail end of it. Mitcher, come 1942, would claim his crew to be ready for war at any time, any place. While the captain, himself the 31st Naval Aviator of the USN, was probably correct in this, well, we'll see how well Hornet's pilots performed in their actual combat duty. That he noted some of them had probably never seen a ship before is an ominous omen, let's say. For the moment, Hornet finished up her sea trials and training. Her crew was almost certainly ready to join in fighting the Japanese, considering the war in the Pacific was already unraveling. One can imagine the confusion of her crew when at the start of February 1942, 2 Army medium bombers, B-25 Mitchells, were launched off the carrier when she sailed off the coast of Virginia. Confusion that would only grow when, after getting a new camouflage paint job, Hornet would pick up her normal air wing of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes. Why did she bother with those B-25s? That answer would partly come when Hornet actually entered the Pacific. Upon arriving in California, 16 B-25s would be stuck on Hornet's deck on April 1st. Though she was actually only supposed to have 15 of them, with that last bomber to be a test to show the pilots involved, they could actually launch from the carrier. It was promptly shanghaied into the mission, a mission that Mitcher was fully aware of, but would only tell the crew once they were well underway. A joint Army-Navy mission under the command of one Jimmy Doolittle that would come to bear his name, the Doolittle Raid. Hornet, completely unable to use her own planes as her flight deck was covered in Army bombers, would join up with her sister Enterprise during this. Coming under the command of Admiral Halsey aboard the older carrier, Hornet and her sister sailed for Japan. The mission was fairly simple. While Enterprise would be the eyes of the task force, and defend her sister should it become necessary, Hornet would carry the Mitchells. Loaded up with only a light bomb load, and as much fuel as they could cram aboard, the Army bombers would fly towards Japan. Not to do any real damage, no. They could never pull that off. This was a raid in the truest sense of the word. A retaliation for Japan's attacks, and to show the Japanese that even the home islands were not safe. A revenge attack, perhaps, but one that would enter into legend. Unfortunately, it would also prove to be the first example of Hornet's apparent misfortune. Well in advance of the designated launch point, itself already at the ragged edge of what the B-25s could manage, the carriers were spotted. A Japanese guard ship that had to promptly be attacked to try and keep it from getting a signal off. This would fail, though the warnings, plural, she got off several, were apparently so garbled the Japanese couldn't figure out what she was warning them about. It would hardly matter, since Doolittle and his men took off early with the result that 15 of those 16 bombers would crash, be it at sea or in mainland China, well short of their designated landing zones. The final plane would land in Soviet territory and be interned for its trouble. The damage the raid did was minimal, but it did serve to remind the Japanese that the USN carriers were still a going concern, which prompted Yamamoto to push even harder for a way to sink them. Hornet, for her part, would join Enterprise in rushing south to try and assist Lexington and Yorktown in holding the Japanese back in the Coral Sea, after refueling and rearming at Pearl Harbor at the end of April, that is. The two sisters would not make it in time, as Lexington succumbed to battle damage, and Yorktown was damaged enough that she was predicted to need months of repairs. Yamamoto would not give that time. While the USN was down to 2 carriers in full operation in the Pacific, though Saratoga was working back up off the west coast, the Japanese would try to draw the Americans into a trap off Midway. That story is well known. Yorktown was rushed through the bare minimum repairs to get her back in action. The 3 sisters sailed for Midway based off codebreakers that identified the Japanese target. The following battle would see those 3 carriers sink 4 of the Japanese ones for the loss of Yorktown. Hornet's role in the battle is... I'm sorry to say there's no easy way to say this. She did far and away the worst of the 3. When Midway began on June 4th, Hornet's pilots had no practical combat experience of note, unlike Yorktown and Enterprise that had been raiding Japanese islands for months by that point. Hornet was still basically green. Not helping matters, her air group commander proved to be especially stubborn and sent his dive bombers and fighters off in the complete wrong direction when the Japanese were spotted and strikes set out. Those planes would not have any impact on the battle's main phase. While there's some argument on where blame actually should go here, with some pointing fingers at Mitcher himself, the results speak more than the causes. The only Hornet aircraft to hit the Japanese carriers, or attempt to anyway, would be the ill-fated VT-8. Bravely charging in despite the odds and their largely outdated aircraft, these men would all be shot down to no practical result. Only one pilot, George Gay, would survive. Adding salt to the wound, one of Yorktown's Wildcats crash-landed aboard Hornet during the battle. The shock of the landing triggered the plane's guns, raking Hornet's superstructure, killing 5 men and wounding 20 more. Perhaps the best that can be said for Hornet at Midway, other than VT-8's brave sacrifice, is that her planes contributed to the attack on the cruisers Mikuma and Mogami. Hornet's bombers hit the latter 5 times, though they didn't sink her. They would also damage 2 destroyers with near misses. Compared to Enterprise and Yorktown sinking 4 carriers, that's less than stellar. Following this battle, with her captain promoted up to admiralship and away from Hornet, her new Captain Mason would take her off to Guadalcanal. Fitted with new aircraft and defensive weaponry, Hornet was far better equipped for this than she had been for Midway, especially with her crew now bloodied in battle. Good thing, considering how that campaign would go. While steaming with Saratoga on August 31st, 1942, Hornet would get to see the submarine I-26 torpedo the bigger and older conversion. This damage would force Saratoga back for repairs, which left Hornet to move on to support Wasp instead, as Enterprise had already pulled back for battle damage from the Eastern Solomons. In this process, Hornet would almost be torpedoed herself on September 6th, though nothing ended up hitting her. Unfortunately for her, Wasp would also be the victim of a Japanese submarine. On September 15th, she would be hit and sunk by the submarine I-19. That left Hornet as the only operational carrier in the area until Enterprise would return in time for the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. This took place on October 26th and would prove to be Hornet's final battle. It wouldn't have seemed that way. Early damage to the light carrier Zuiho put her flight deck out of action. Furthermore, Hornet's bombers would finally redeem themselves for Midway. Her SBDs would heavily damage both Shokaku, unlucky as that ship would prove to be, and the heavier cruiser Chikuma. This was a good result, taking both a cruiser and 1 fleet carrier out of the battle, even if neither would end up sinking. However, Hornet's own misfortune would act up again. You see, while ostensibly operating together, Hornet and Enterprise were sailing miles apart with their respective escorts. Enterprise would find a lucky break, sailing into a rain squall as the Japanese attack force, launched before their own carriers were hit, came into action. This would leave Hornet as the only visible target, resulting in her being subjected to a hailstorm of attack. In spite of fierce anti-aircraft fire, Hornet would be hit by 3 bombs from Val dive bombers. One further one, damaged and going down anyway, crashed into Hornet's Island. That damaged the superstructure, killed 7 men, and spread burning fuel across her deck. A further attack by Kate torpedo bombers saw 2 torpedoes slam into Hornet's side, crippling her electrical systems and engines, much as had happened to Yorktown at Midway. While the first Val could be written off as desperation, a second damaged dive bomber would very deliberately crash into Hornet's port side bow after she came to a halt. That proto-kamikaze at least did minimal damage. Crippled and wallowing in place, Hornet would escape further attack for a little while, as Enterprise became visible again and the Japanese attacked her instead. That allowed her crew to do some repairs to her propulsion and electrical plant, while a tow line was set up to USS Northampton. This allowed the carrier to crawl out of the area at 5 knots. It wasn't enough. 9 more Kates attacked Hornet during this process, and while 8 missed, the 9th slammed a further torpedo into Hornet's battered starboard side. That was the death blow. Not immediately, as Hornet stubbornly remained afloat, but her battered engineering plant gave up the ghost, and the carrier took on a severe list of 14 degrees. With Japanese surface forces charging in, and Hornet clearly not going to be moving under her own power, the towing efforts were called off. While Hornet could theoretically still be saved, the risk was far too great. She was abandoned, Captain Mason the last man to leave, as efforts began to scuttle the carrier. 9 torpedoes were fired into her side, which being American early war torpedoes, probably didn't do as much as was hoped. Further, more than 400 5-inch shells pounded the carrier. All this effort failed to sink her, though when the Americans left, one can imagine they expected her to soon sink. As it turned out, the Japanese would come across Hornet later that day, still stubbornly afloat, albeit listing even more. While the Japanese briefly considered boarding her to take Hornet as a prize, an interesting alternate history scenario perhaps, they decided she was a write-off. Probably accurately. 4 long-lance torpedoes from a pair of destroyers finished what the American fish had failed. USS Hornet sank at about 1:30 on the night on October 27th. Her wreck would be found in January 2019, more than 17,000 feet, about 5 kilometers, down. Hornet's wreck is mostly intact and upright, though her signal bridge and part of her stern are broken off. While Hornet was, perhaps, an unlucky ship, she fought with everything she had. This is something to be respected. She never gave up until the bitter end, and her crew fought valiantly. That should be what she's remembered for, not her disappointing performance at Midway, I think. And who knows, maybe one day I'll do an alternate history where Hornet found that squall at Santa Cruz, and Enterprise was the one caught in the open. It could very easily have happened that way. But that is a story for another video. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.